The fragile threshold between ultimate sporting immortality and career-ending physical catastrophe is often separated by a single millisecond of biological friction on the grass. In the hypermoneized ecosystem of modern international football, elite human assets train for years to optimize their baseline conditioning parameters, spending thousands of hours inside high-margin sports science facilities just to represent their national colors on the global stage. Yet, when the stadium floodlights activate and the competitive velocity of a World Cup match reaches its absolute peak, no amount of capital investment or predictive algorithmic formatting can protect a human frame from a sudden, violent structural failure. We watch these global icons execute high-stakes playbooks under the eyes of millions, treating them as automated machines capable of absorbing maximum impact, until a solitary, sickening snap cuts through the stadium roar, leaving a world-class athlete stranded in a freezing void of psychological and physical agony. What happened to them after those bone-crushing moments? How is it even possible that an entire career blueprint can be permanently deleted in a fraction of a second? As we prepare to execute our investigative countdown across the absolute dark ledger of international tournament history, we are actively tracing a highly specific lineage of medical catastrophes that permanently altered the competitive balance of world football. We will journey through historical archives saturated with structural breaks, high-friction collisions, and career-altering diagnoses that typical 5-minute highlight reels systematically skip. You will see prime finishes and unyielding defensive anchors reduced to absolute vulnerability, their professional market equity and long-term resale value zeroed out in a matter of 30 seconds under the unfeeling gaze of central television cameras. But while names like Francesco Totti, Michael Owen, or Roberto Baggio evoke deep reverence among soccer purists, our absolute number one entry represents a moment of biological trauma so intense, so visually terrifying, and so institutionally significant that it fundamentally forced international governing bodies to permanently rewrite the medical protocols of the modern game, shifting entire private equity spreadsheets overnight. To understand the immense gravity of these physical tragedies, one must look completely past the clinical match statistics and analyze the fresh, bleeding wounds of our contemporary era. Just months ago, during the high-velocity opening brackets of the landmark 2026 World Cup, the tiny footballing community of Canada was preparing to validate its golden generation on the greatest stage in North America. At the absolute center of this tactical blueprint stood Ismael Koné, a dynamic, high-value midfielder whose technical distribution and rapid cardiovascular velocity had captured the attention of elite scouts across Western Europe. The domestic supporters didn't view his presence as a standard line item on a team sheet. He was the primary engine of their competitive ambition, a symbol of a rising footballing nation that refused to accept mediocrity. But as the matchday clock entered a high-pressure defensive transition against a ruthless opponent, the baseline geometry of Koné's career shattered in an instant, proving that the road to footballing glory is paved with an unforgiving, industrial level of physical risk that no private equity spreadsheet could ever calculate. The sickening mechanical snap that followed his final tackle did not just fracture a bone, it instantly froze the entire stadium, plunging a roaring home crowd into an absolute, breathless silence as medical crews launched an emergency operational sprint onto the pitch. But as the cameras flipped away to shield the global audience from the visceral reality of his biological structural collapse, Koné's tragic freeze was merely opening the gates to a much larger, darker archive of historical suffering. We begin our official ranking with a look at another world-class asset whose entire career was derailed by a tackle so violently unyielding it shattered an elite club's multi-million-dollar title campaign, setting the stage for our number 11 entry. To truly appreciate how a split-second structural collapse can erase a footballing empire's multi-million-dollar strategy, we must unlock the dark archive of the late 2000s, an era when elite player values were audited on completely different spreadsheet parameters than the hyperinflated numbers of today. Long before contemporary private equity cartels took absolute control of stadium retail sales and automated tracking links, an international asset named Eduardo da Silva was operating at the absolute peak of his technical distribution curves. In February 2008, the naturalized Croatian striker was single-handedly driving Arsenal toward a prestigious Premier League title with an incredible run of 22 goal contributions. To the predictive data models of global sports management, Eduardo was a phenomenally efficient machine, a player whose neuromuscular orientation and clinical finishing had driven his transfer market equity to a vertical trajectory. He was no longer treated by directors as a secondary regional prospect. He was a premium multi-million euro brand investment whose performance ledger was destined to dominate international television floodlights for the next decade. But the calculated life cycle metrics of an elite professional forward can be permanently written down to zero in a single, unregulated millisecond of physical friction on the grass. The high-velocity collision occurred during a standard domestic fixture against Birmingham City, when defender Martin Taylor executed a reckless, high-friction sliding tackle that missed the ball entirely and sliced directly into Eduardo's left leg. The resulting impact generated an absolute structural collapse, a devastating fibular fracture and open dislocation of the ankle joint so severe that the bone fibers actively tore through his technical sock under the blinding glare of central media cameras. The visual reality of this biological structural failure was so intense, so deeply traumatic to witness in real time, that Sky Sports systematically refused to execute a single slow-motion replay of the event, completely shielding the global audience from the graphic dissolution of a human frame. The stadium roar instantly dropped into a sudden, breathless silence as medical crews launched an emergency operational sprint, rushing an entire container of medical oxygen onto the pitch to stabilize his shifting cardiovascular metrics. It was a high-stakes medical crisis where a single administrative error or technical delay in processing his evacuation would have resulted in an immediate amputation curve. The financial tax applied to this physical tragedy extended far past the immediate hospital parameters and insurance adjustments. Eduardo spent a brutal year trapped inside dark rehabilitation wings, working relentlessly through 26 separate minor microsurgeries to salvage his neuromuscular alignment and reconstruct his shattered joint geometry far away from the public media pipeline. He managed to escape the freezing void of an early retirement path, but when his agency compiled his final statistical profile, the calculations were brutally unforgiving. The clinical reaction velocity and baseline explosion speed that had once driven his market equity to elite levels had suffered a massive, decimal point drop that he could never completely reverse. He missed the historic international tournaments of his generation, dropped completely from Arsenal's first-team balance sheet, and was systematically sold to a lower-yield division in Ukraine for a mere fraction of his peak resale value, transformed into a nomadic outcast looked past by the traditional cartels of the game. But while the tragic case of Eduardo remains an absolute warning script about the physical vulnerabilities of a striker's skeletal frame, the history of the beautiful game contains an entry where a world-class finisher saw his entire physical empire collapse without a single opponent even touching his body. Our next position uncovers a chilling baseline malfunction where an elite knee exploded under the pressure of its own multi-million-dollar expectations, setting the stage for our number 10 entry. To fully understand how the mechanical architecture of a world-class finisher can be violently dismantled without a single opponent executing a high-friction tackle, we must audit our number 10 entry, Radamel Falcao in 2014. In the operational ledger of global sports business, the Colombian striker known as El Tigre was a premium, high-margin asset valued at an astronomical 60 million euros, single-handedly driving Monaco's long-term corporate expansion layout. To the predictive data models and transfer market spreadsheets, Falcao was an incredible biological phenomenon, a modern number 9 whose neuromuscular reaction velocity and spatial distribution parameters made him an absolute nightmare for elite defensive fortresses. He had logged an exceptional track record across Western Europe, converting 90-minute appearances into clinical goal-scoring dividends for Atletico Madrid and Porto. He sat down with international media channels, making it crystal clear that the upcoming tournament in Brazil would be the absolute peak of his competitive legacy, a high-visibility laboratory designed to secure his brand immortality on the grass. The structural tragedy did not unfold inside a high-yield European fortress under the blinding glare of primary television networks. It materialized during a low-profile French Cup fixture against Chasselet, an underfunded club matching lower-tier amateur logistics. As Falcao executed a rapid cardiovascular burst inside the 6-yard box, an unheralded defender named Sona Ertek launched an unregulated, sliding attempt to clear the ball's velocity. The resulting impact did not fracture the bone fibers or create an open dislocation curve, but it systematically severed his anterior cruciate ligament, generating an immediate biological structural collapse in his left knee joint. The visual data of El Tigre clutching his leg on an unwatered pitch threw an entire South American nation into an absolute state of psychological panic, completely frozen by the sudden realization that their primary competitive engine had been wrote down to zero. The medical directors launched an emergency operational sprint, routing the asset straight to specialized surgical wings in Portugal to initiate a desperate calculation against the chronological clock. The financial tax applied to this biological failure altered the transfer gravity of the entire European marketplace. Falcao and his agency spent 5 consecutive months trapped inside isolated rehabilitation labs, attempting to force a miracle recovery path before the initial group stage matchday sheets were countersigned by FIFA officials. But the clinical algorithms governing human ligament geometry are brutally looked past by romantic sports journalists. When a primary connective fiber is completely torn, the baseline acceleration speed and physical explosion vectors suffer a permanent decimal point drop. Falcao looked past his prime international showcase, watching from the substitution zone as his country advanced without his technical presence, leaving his individual valuation index to collapse into a freezing void of depreciation. The soft drink and sports apparel giants systematically updated their tracking scripts, removing his brand real estate from upcoming global campaigns while his club prepared a series of high-risk loan migrations to salvage his remaining resale value. He returned to the grass as a nomadic outcast, navigating unglamorous loan spells at Manchester United and Chelsea where his macro-level metrics looked past his former superiority, a stark contrast to the elite asset that had once commanded €60 million. But while Falcao's knee failure stands as a devastating monument to the structural limits of an orthodox striker, our number 9 entry uncovers a French icon who experienced the literal disintegration of his lower limbs in back-to-back qualification campaigns, setting the stage for a mechanical horror story so visually terrifying it forced international medical crews to permanently change their emergency field protocols. To truly understand how the relentless physical and financial stress of international football can completely break a world-class athlete's career projection, we must look into our number 9 entry, Djibril Cissé in 2006. In the highly managed world of sports business, a primary forward is treated as a premium corporate asset, with multi-million euro private equity contracts designed to extract maximum goals and television visibility across primary platforms. Cissé was a phenomenally explosive asset for Liverpool, a striker whose raw acceleration curves and clinical neuromuscular precision had forced elite European club directors to monitor his tracking links with intense interest. He had successfully recovered from a horrific, high-friction leg fracture sustained in domestic club play in 2004, defying the medical spreadsheet models to reclaim his baseline scoring velocity. By May 2006, the French international was formatted to become the primary attacking engine for a superstar France squad prepared to challenge for global immortality under the blinding stadium floodlights of Germany. The biological structural failure occurred during a low-visibility pre-tournament warm-up fixture against China, a match intended to validate the squad's tactical preparation parameters before the official matchday sheets were countersigned by FIFA officials. As Cissé executed a high-velocity cardiovascular sprint down the right flank, tracking a diagonal pass, a challenging defender executed an aggressive, unyielding shoulder challenge that threw his physical alignment off balance. As his right technical boot gripped the grass, his leg twisted under the immense weight of his own momentum, generating an absolute structural collapse. The sickening mechanical snap of his tibia and fibula breaking apart was so visceral, so visually terrorizante, that the surrounding players immediately looked past their tactical positions and waved frantically for medical crews to launch an emergency operational sprint onto the pitch. The stadium roar plummeted into an absolute freeze of psychological panic as television cameras quickly looked past the graphic dissolution of his lower limb to preserve global broadcasting optics. The financial tax applied to this tragic mechanical failure completely deleted his career trajectory within the primary European cartels. While the French squad executed a historic march straight to the peak of the global game, eventually falling in a dramatic final penalty shootout against Italy, Cissé was stranded inside isolated medical labs, watching his teammates cross into footballing immortality from a cold hospital bed. The automated transfer algorithms and club spreadsheets look past his historical performance profile, violently writing down his resale value to an absolute fraction of his peak contract parameters. Liverpool's administrative directors, operating under an unfeeling corporate matrix that treats injured personnel as redline financial liabilities, systematically looked past his long-term contract real estate, engineering a permanent loan migration to Marseille to clear his high wages from their payroll spreadsheet. He returned to the grass as a nomadic outcast, chasing his former explosion velocity across alternative, lower-yield leagues in Greece and Russia, completely looked past by the primary digital tracking campaigns of the global game. But while CCS double fracture remains an absolute testament to the cruel, physical vulnerabilities hidden beneath an athlete's prime conditioning, the archive of international tournament history contains an entry where an iconic superstar managed to cheat a devastating biological collapse through a sheer miracle of metal and engineering. Our next position uncovers a legendary captain who saw his ankle joint completely shattered just months before the tournament began, forcing an entire footballing superpower to launch an emergency medical race against time that soccer purists still struggle to believe, setting the stage for our number 8 entry. To fully comprehend how the terrifying geometry of a physical breakdown can be completely overridden by a sheer miracle of human will and metal engineering, we must unlock our number 8 entry, Francesco Totti in 2006. In the highly managed marketplace of modern Italian sports business, the legendary captain of AS Roma was treated by club directors as an absolute, irreplaceable institutional life item, a player whose neuromuscular distribution loops and cultural brand real estate were valued at levels traditional spreadsheets simply couldn't format. Totti was the absolute creative engine of the Azzurri, an icon formatted to dictate the entire attacking strategy of a nation prepared to challenge for global immortality under the blinding floodlights of Germany. But in February 2006, just 4 months before the opening group stage matchday sheets were scheduled to be countersigned by FIFA officials, the baseline structure of his career suffered a catastrophic mechanical collapse during a standard domestic fixture against Empoli. An unregulated, high-friction tackle from behind fractured his left fibula and violently severed the primary connective ligaments in his ankle joint, writing his physical valuation index down to an absolute state of 0. The immediate diagnostic parameters compiled by Roma Sports Science medical wings suggested an absolute professional culling, a devastating physical tax that looked past his chances of traveling to Germany entirely. To the automated predictive data models used by transfer cartels, a 30-year-old forward experiencing that level of biological structural failure was facing a freezing void of permanent competitive decline. But soccer purists know that the human variable can violently break the laws of medical probability. Professors and orthopedic surgeons launched an emergency operational sprint, executing a complex surgical layout that integrated a prominent metal plate and 8 localized steel screws directly into his damaged bone fibers to stabilize his shifting joint geometry. Totti spent 3 brutal months trapped inside dark rehabilitation labs, enduring an intense cardiovascular and muscular preparation loop far away from the global television trends, fighting against a chronological clock that was rapidly counting down to 0. When Marcello Lippi finalized his official World Cup tracking registry, he looked past the clinical risks and locked the Roman captain straight into the primary attacking playbook, a high-stakes calculation that shocked Western analytical boardrooms. Totti stepped onto the German grass with his left ankle joint literally held together by industrial metal pins, executing high-pressure 90-minute performances while his neuromuscular feedback loops were operating under extreme biological stress. He wasn't playing with the fluid explosion velocity of his prime years, but his tactical orientation and clinical vision allowed him to distribute vital dividends to his teammates, culminando in a clinical, sub-second injury time penalty against Australia that propelled Italy straight toward the quarterfinals. He started all 7 tournament fixtures, defied the unfeeling automated algorithms of the transfer cartels, and eventually lifted the prestigious World Cup trophy in Berlin, transforming his broken frame into an immortal monument of pure, unregulated willpower. The financial real estate of his career survived the structural drop, secure his permanent position as an untouchable titan within the Lusophone and international football archives long after the physical tax had been paid in full. But while Totti's metal-engineered miracle remains an incredible testament to the psychological density of a true mature steward, our number 7 entry uncovers an English prodigy whose biological infrastructure exploded completely on its own, logging a devastating baseline malfunction within the first 60 seconds of a matchday window that permanently derailed a billion-pound international blueprint, setting the stage for a mechanical horror story that soccer purists still struggle to audit. The internal anatomy of a high-velocity sports franchise confirms that when an elite athletic engine breaks down, the financial shockwaves ripple instantly across global private equity partnerships and international transfer spreadsheets. To understand how a solitary anatomical failure can permanently dismantle a multi-million-dollar international layout, we must audit our number 7 entry, Michael Owen in 2006. In the highly competitive world of football asset tracking, the English forward was treated by club directors as a premium, high-margin investment whose clinical distribution and clinical finishing curves were valued at numbers standard industries simply couldn't format. Owen was a generational icon, a striker whose explosive speed and sub-second reaction velocity had driven Newcastle United to execute a record-breaking financial transaction to rescue his name from the demanding substitutions bench of Real Madrid. He sat down with central media channels, making it crystal clear that the tournament in Germany would serve as his absolute, high-visibility laboratory to reclaim his absolute throne on the grass. The biological structural failure materialized with a terrifying level of visceral trauma during a high-stakes group stage alignment against Sweden. As the opening matchday clock crossed the literal 60-second window, Owen executed a standard positioning adjustment near the touchline, tracking a routine technical distribution from his midfield line. There was no aggressive sliding tackle from a challenging defender, no high-friction physical collision against an unyielding opponent, and no unregulated force applied to his lower frame. Instead, his right technical boot gripped the grass awkwardly, and under the immense pressure of his own acceleration vectors, his anterior cruciate ligament violently exploded entirely on its own. The visual data of a former Ballon d'Or winner crawling completely off the pitch like a broken machine threw millions of domestic supporters into an absolute state of psychological panic, completely frozen by the sickening realization that England's primary competitive engine had been wrote down to zero in real time. The financial tax applied to this mechanical collapse altered the structural rules of player protection within international governing bodies forever. Owen was forced into a freezing void of isolated medical labs, undergoing a severe reconstructive surgical layout followed by 12 consecutive months of agonizing neuromuscular rehabilitation far away from the blinding television floodlights. While his international teammates faced a dramatic penalty shootout elimination against Portugal, Newcastle United's executive board members were left confronting an absolute structural gridlock. Their record-breaking £69 million asset was permanently red-lined on the first-team balance sheet, generating zero competitive dividends while sucking millions in weekly insurance retainers from their operational budgets. The unfeeling corporate algorithms of the transfer market systematically wrote down his resale value to an absolute fraction of his peak historical numbers, permanently breaking the long-term progression model engineered by the club's directors. The political friction generated by this physical tragedy forced FIFA to permanently restructure its industrial compensation parameters, establishing multi-million-dollar insurance pools to protect clubs from the devastating financial fallout of international player availability. Owen returned to the grass as a nomadic outcast, chasing his former explosion velocity through low-yield properties where his physical frame looked past his former superiority, looked past by the primary digital tracking campaigns of the global game. But while Owen's isolated ligament explosion stands as a chilling monument to the unpredictable vulnerabilities of a striker's architecture, our number 6 entry uncovers an international icon who faced an act of raw, unregulated physical violence so brutally unyielding it transcended the boundaries of sport, plunging a global audience into an absolute state of horror that changed the refereeing protocols of the World Cup forever. When you audit the complete dark ledger of international tournament play, the line dividing aggressive physical competition from unregulated, near-fatal violence is parsed by fractions of a second and the clinical decisions of on-field officials. To understand how a sporting arena can violently transform into a literal medical crime scene, we must analyze our number 6 entry, Patrick Battiston in 1982. During this historical era of the beautiful game, long before modern private equity cartels and data-driven tracking links optimized player safety loops, international fixtures operated under an immense, raw level of physical friction. Battiston was a highly elegant French international defender whose tactical orientation and defensive distribution had propelled his national team straight into a high-stakes World Cup semi-final against West Germany in Seville. The supporters in Paris didn't treat his asset sheet as a standard defensive line item. He was a vital component of a golden generation engineered to secure international glory. But the calculated strategic layouts of the French technical staff were completely written down to zero by a terrifying act of biological trauma that changed the policing protocols of the grass forever. The physical catastrophe occurred in the second half of the match, when Battiston executed a rapid cardiovascular sprint to chase a clinical, lofted pass from Michel Platini that sliced straight through the German defensive grid. As the French defender reached the edge of the 18-yard box, ahead of the tracking variables, West German goalkeeper Harald Schumacher launched an incredibly aggressive, high-velocity operational sprint off his goal line. Schumacher looked past the ball entirely, leaped into the air, and rotated his entire physical frame, converting his skeletal mass into a high-friction weapon that collided directly with Battiston's face at maximum speed. The visual reality of the impact was so brutally unyielding that the French defender was instantly knocked unconscious before his body hit the grass, his neuromuscular feedback loops suffering a total, catastrophic shutdown. The stadium roar dropped into a chilling freeze of psychological panic as teammates looked past their positions, rushing frantically toward a body that lay completely motionless, with several teeth violently extracted from his jaw and a broken vertebra paralyzing his baseline physical movement index. The institutional fallout and political friction generated by this physical tragedy exposed the severe limitations of the era's refereeing framework, as Dutch official Charles Corver looked past the entire biological destruction and failed to execute a single disciplinary wire, granting a routine goal kick instead of an absolute red card. While Battiston was trapped inside a sudden medical coma, with emergency crews launching a desperate operational sprint to administer oxygen on the pitch, Schumacher casually stood by his post, adjusting his technical gloves with an unfeeling indifference that horrified millions of global television viewers. The financial real estate of the tournament was permanently stained by this unregulated violence, turning a high-visibility sporting laboratory into an international scandal that required executive political intervention between the states of France and West Germany to diffuse the diplomatic tension. Battiston survived the freezing void of that dark Seville afternoon, spending months inside clinical labs to reconstruct his jaw geometry, but his baseline explosion velocity and professional market equity were written down to an absolute fraction of his peak potential parameters. He eventually returned to the grass as a mature steward of the game, carrying the physical and emotional tax of that collision for the remainder of his professional life cycle, completely looked past by the glamorous commercial pipelines of the modern sport. But while the near-fatal trauma of Battiston remains a terrifying testament to the unchecked brutality hidden within the game's historical archives, our number 5 entry uncovers an Italian icon who willingly entered a high-stakes final matchday window with his lower skeletal infrastructure already completely destroyed, forcing an entire footballing superpower to watch their primary emperor execute a final display of defiance that defied all sports science tracking systems. When we audit the physical trauma tracks within our global countdown, the absolute boundary between a standard sports medical file and a historical display of raw human defiance is completely defined by the depth of psychological density an athlete can summon under pressure. To understand how an elite performer can willingly force their broken biological system to execute a high-stakes playbook, we must analyze our number 5 entry, Roberto Baggio in 1994. In the highly managed ecosystem of international sports private equity, the Italian playmaker was treated by federation directors as a premium, irreplaceable branding vehicle whose market equity dictated the absolute value of their global tournament campaign. Baggio was the undisputed creative engine of the Azzurri, an icon whose technical distribution curves and clinical finish velocity had single-handedly dragged a fractured squad straight through the knockout brackets of the United States. But as the matchday clock ticked toward the ultimate competitive alignment in Pasadena, a historic final against a ruthless Brazilian dynasty, Baggio's physical framework suffered a catastrophic baseline malfunction, leaving his hamstring tendon severely torn and his knee geometry completely unstable. To the automated predictive data spreadsheets of modern sports science laboratories, an asset operating under that level of muscular structural failure is passed through as an absolute, zero-margin risk that should be culled from the first-team balance sheet immediately. Traditional medical algorithms state that when a muscle fiber experiences a severe tear, the baseline acceleration speed and physical explosion vectors suffer a permanent decimal point drop that cannot be bypassed without weeks of total operational freeze. But Baggio looked completely past the unfeeling metrics of the transfer cartels, refusing to let a clinical software sheet dictate the absolute climax of his international life cycle. He entered a frantic, closed-door laboratory with medical stewards, executing an unregulated race against time that involved injecting massive doses of localized painkillers directly into his bleeding leg tissue, attempting to temporarily freeze his neuromuscular feedback loops just long enough to step onto the grass under the blinding California floodlights. The physical tax applied to this decision was visible in every single 90-minute motion, as Baggio gritted his teeth through an intense state of visceral agony, forcing his damaged limbs to chase the ball against a high-velocity Brazilian defensive grid. He wasn't playing with the fluid reaction speed of his prime years. He was executing a high-stakes psychological drama for an entire nation, transforming his vulnerability into a masterclass of pure human endurance. But while soccer purists romance about the unburdened beauty of his defiance, the unfeeling reality of sports business metrics finalizes his sacrifice on a cold ledger of heartbreak. After 120 minutes of unregulated physical friction, with his hamstring completely destroyed, Baggio stepped up to execute the final, defining penalty kick, only to watch the ball fly straight over the crossbar into the roaring crowd. It was a tragic, breathless freeze that left his individual valuation index to plummet into a void of permanent competitive sorrow, showing that even the most immortal willpower cannot fully override a biological structural collapse. The image of Baggio standing motionless with his head bowed remains an absolute, haunting monument to the cruel physical tax demanded by the global entertainment complex, a moment where the true cost of excellence was logged in full public view. But while Baggio's Pasadena tragedy stands as a historic baseline of physical sacrifice, our number 4 entry uncovers a bizarro medical paradox where an elite European icon saw his entire tournament destiny permanently deleted before it even started. Not by an aggressive sliding tackle on the pitch, but by a solitary glass of perfume in a luxury hotel bathroom, setting the stage for a clinical cliffhanger that soccer purists still struggle to audit. When we audit the complete chronological matrix of international tournament catastrophes, the most terrifying disruptions to an elite player's career real estate do not always develop from a high-friction physical collision under the blinding glare of primary stadium floodlights. To fully comprehend how the fragile baseline parameters of an international sporting destiny can be written down to absolute zero by a bizarre, domestic household anomaly, we must analyze our number 4 entry, Santiago Canizares in 2002. In the highly competitive ecosystem of modern football asset management, the Spanish goalkeeper was operating at the absolute peak of his technical distribution loops and reaction velocity curves. Having single-handedly anchored Valencia to prestigious domestic titles and European finals, Canizares was systematically formatted by the national coaching staff to be the undisputed starting guardian for a superstar Spain squad prepared to challenge for global immortality in South Korea and Japan. To the executive directors and predictive transfer spreadsheets, his physical frame represented a premium, multi-million euro security layout, an asset whose long-term contract value was built on decades of raw, unregulated dedication to the beautiful game. The structural tragedy did not unfold on the grass of a high-pressure qualification arena or during a high-intensity training window. It executed its absolute finality inside the quiet, isolated confines of a luxury hotel bathroom at the national team's preparation camp. As Canizares completed his standard personal conditioning routine, a solitary glass bottle of aftershave slipped from his hands, shattering violently against the tiled floor. In a split-second reflex optimized by years of sub-second goalkeeper reaction training, the Spanish legend attempted to trap the falling object with his right foot. A jagged shard of glass sliced directly through his skin fibers, cleanly severing the primary extensor tendon of his great toe in a matter of a single, sickening moment. The immediate medical diagnostic reports compiled by the team sports science wings confirmed an absolute biological disaster, a clean tendon rupture that instantly froze his physical movement index and deleted his upcoming tournament destiny before a single matchday sheet could even be countersigned. The financial and institutional tax applied to this domestic freak accident permanently altered the geopolitical trajectory of Spanish football history. Canizares spent the entire global showcase trapped inside isolated medical wings and dark rehabilitation labs, watching his national teammates cross over into a highly controversial tournament campaign far away from his protective presence. The automated tracking algorithms and club spreadsheets look past his historical performance profile, instantly drop his individual market equity into a freezing void of competitive stagnation. But while his personal life cycle suffered a severe structural drop, the administrative void left by his sudden evacuation opened a massive, unprecedented pipeline for a dynamic 21-year-old backup named Iker Casillas. The young asset stepped straight into the blinding international spotlight, executing a series of legendary penalty kick saves against Ireland that launched his own multi-billion-dollar empire on the global stage, proving that one asset's catastrophic breakdown is often the precise mechanism that forces a new king onto the absolute throne. Canizares returned to the grass months later, carrying the severe emotional and physical toll of an international dream deleted by a broken glass bottle, a nomadic steward who would never again get the chronological chance to command his nation's defensive real estate at a World Cup. But as the dark archive of international suffering continues its relentless countdown toward the ultimate climax, our next position uncovers an English defensive anchor who experienced an open structural break so brutally graphic, so physically devastating, that it required 26 separate surgeries just to prevent a literal medical amputation, setting the stage for our number 3 entry. When we scale the terrifying ladder of orthopedic devastation within the international football archives, the structural entries begin to transcend the standard parameters of athletic recoveries and move directly into the realm of medical warfare. To fully comprehend how the financial and competitive real estate of a professional athlete can be permanently shattered by an on-field structural collapse, we must audit our number 3 entry, David Bust. While this catastrophic mechanical breakdown did not execute its visual trauma during the absolute final matchday window of a World Cup tournament, its geopolitical impact on player safety regulations and the psychological formatting of the modern game is etched deeply into the history of the sport. In April 1996, Bust was operating as a highly resilient, unyielding defensive anchor for Coventry City, matching up against a legendary Manchester United dynasty under the blinding stadium floodlights of Old Trafford. To the predictive data models and transfer spreadsheets of the era, he wasn't treated as a high-margin commercial asset destined for global branding monopolies. He was a mature steward of tactical defense whose physical durability was built on raw, unregulated grit. The biological structural failure activated just 2 minutes into the match, when Bust executed a rapid cardiovascular sprint into the opposing penalty box during a routine corner kick layout. As he launched his physical frame forward to track a loose ball's velocity, he collided with maximum impact between the incoming challengers of Brian McClare and Dennis Irwin. The resulting forces generated an absolute, catastrophic structural collapse, an extensive compound fracture of his right tibia and fibula so violent, so brutally unyielding, that the bone fibers instantly fractured completely apart and tore straight through his skin tissue. The visual data of the open break was so intensely traumatic that Manchester United's legendary goalkeeper Peter Schmeichel looked at the physical dissolution of Bust's limb, turned completely away, and actively vomited on the grass, his neuromuscular feedback loops suffering an immediate psychological shock. The stadium roar dropped into a frozen void of breathless silence as medical stewards launched an emergency operational sprint, executing a desperate field evacuation while groundskeepers rushed onto the pitch to clean buckets of blood from the grass. The true financial and human tax applied to this mechanical collapse looked past all typical recovery trajectories engineered by traditional sports science wings. Bust did not spend a routine 6 months inside specialized rehabilitation labs. He was thrown straight into a dark, terrifying battle for physical survival, enduring 26 separate microsurgeries over a matter of months far away from the public media pipeline. His hospital timeline became an absolute gridlock as a severe hospital-acquired MRSA infection actively invaded his damaged tissue, threatening to force an immediate medical amputation curve of his entire right lower limb. The unfeeling algorithms of the transfer cartels quickly redlined his individual market equity, dropping his career lifecycle data down to an absolute valuation ledger of 0 as it became explicitly clear that his professional playing days had been permanently written down. He looked past his dreams of ever representing his country on the international stage, forced into an early retirement path before his prime could ever be fully logged by global tracking networks. The institutional legacy of his suffering forced international governing bodies to permanently audit their on-field emergency formatting, accelerating the development of rapid response medical channels to protect multi-million-dollar human assets from the permanent fallout of unchecked physical friction on the grass. But as our dark archive approaches its ultimate climax, The countdown crosses the boundary from absolute physical tragedy into a territory of historic national redemption, a legendary arena where a global icon faced the literal explosion of his knee ligaments on live television, yet managed to rewrite the entire data profile of sports science to lift a nation out of despair, setting the stage for our number 2 entry. When we near the absolute peak of our chronological matrix of orthopedic disasters, the entries mutate from localized skeletal breaks into massive, existential crises that fundamentally reconfigured the medical architecture of modern global sports economics. To fully grasp how the physical destruction of a single human knee can spark an immortal multimillion-dollar redemption arc, we audit our number 2 entry, Ronaldo Nazario in 2000. In the high-velocity landscape of international football finance, the Brazilian phenom was treated by executive boardrooms as a premium sovereign monopoly, a sporting superpower whose technical explosion vectors and global brand real estate had driven Inter Milan to shatter the world transfer record to secure his name on the balance sheet. Ronaldo was the ultimate engine of the beautiful game, an asset whose neuromuscular reaction velocity and clinical distribution loops generated billions in retail dividends for international television networks and sportswear cartels. But the unfeeling spreadsheets of private equity can be instantly rewritten by a single, catastrophic failure of bone and tendon on the grass. The terrifying biological collapse activated in April 2000, during a high-stakes Italian Cup final matchday window against Lazio at the Stadio Olimpico. Ronaldo was making his frantic, highly anticipated return to the pitch after spending 7 months inside medical labs recovering from a partial tendon rupture, a recovery cycle that team directors had rushed to optimize before the upcoming summer tournament brackets were countersigned. As the Brazilian striker executed his absolute trademark move, a high-velocity stepover designed to violently unbalance the opposing defensive grid, his right kneecap completely displaced as the patella tendon exploded entirely on its own under the immense weight of his raw physical momentum. There was no high-friction physical collision against an unyielding challenger, no reckless sliding tackle from an opponent, and no unregulated external force applied to his lower frame. It was a chilling baseline malfunction where the muscle fibers literally tore away from the bone in real time, captured live by central broadcasting channels. The visual data of Ronaldo clutching his completely disintegrated knee joint while screaming in visceral, psychological agony through the global footballing community into an absolute state of horror, a breathless freeze that permanently frozen the stadium roar. The medical stewards launched an emergency operational sprint onto the pitch, executing a delicate evacuation layout as teammates looked past their tactical zones, weeping openly at the graphic dissolution of the world's most valuable footballing asset. The immediate diagnostic reports were brutally unforgiving, suggesting an absolute professional culling that should have forced the 23-year-old phenom straight into a freezing void of permanent retirement. The automated tracking algorithms of the transfer cartels quickly wrote down his market equity to zero, with prominent specialists declaring that the clinical explosion velocity and baseline acceleration speed that defined his global brand could never be systematically recovered. Ronaldo spent a brutal period of 3 consecutive years trapped inside dark rehabilitation labs, working through multiple reconstructive surgical layouts to manually rebuild his shattered joint geometry far away from the public media pipeline. He defied the cold mathematical algorithms of the scouting monopolies, engineering a miraculous competitive resurrection that culminated in his historic 8-goal masterclass at the 2002 World Cup, proving that the human variable can rewrite the cold data of sports science. But while Ronaldo's Tokyo redemption remains the most legendary medical comeback story logged in human history, our absolute number 1 entry uncovers a moment of biological trauma so devastatingly profound that it did not just break an asset. It violently shattered the emotional empire of an entire host nation in a matter of 2 centimeters, setting the stage for the most traumatic climax our archive has ever unlocked. When we audit the absolute, terminal climax of our global archive of physical devastation, we arrive at a moment that didn't just break a professional athlete. It triggered a profound, irreversible psychological collapse of an entire host nation. Our number 1 entry, Neymar Jr. in 2014. In the highly managed, hyperinflated landscape of modern football business, the Brazilian icon was treated by global corporate cartels as a primary sovereign monopoly, a multi-billion-dollar branding vehicle whose technical distribution and clinical finish velocity were the absolute anchors of the country's high-stakes World Cup campaign. To the local supporters, he was more than a professional asset. He was the primary emotional vessel for their historical sporting destiny. But the cold, unfeeling metrics of elite sports collided with raw human fragility during a high-pressure quarterfinal fixture against Colombia, triggering a mechanical horror story that redefined the tournament's trajectory in a matter of 2 centimeters. The biological structural failure occurred in the final minutes of the match, as Brazil held a narrow competitive lead. Neymar executed a high-velocity sprint to control a distribution loop, when Colombian defender Juan Camilo Zuniga launched an unregulated, high-friction collision, driving his knee directly into the lumbar vertebrae of the Brazilian captain at maximum acceleration velocity. The sickening mechanical sound of the third lumbar vertebra fracturing under the force was clearly audible even to the players located on the opposite side of the pitch. The visual data of Neymar collapsing into the grass, looked past his own physical movement index and screaming in a state of absolute, visceral agony, looked past the typical refereeing protocols of the game entirely. The stadium roar plummeted into a terrifying void of silence as the team's medical stewards launched an emergency operational sprint onto the grass, desperately attempting to stabilize his spine geometry while millions of global television viewers looked past the broadcast to witness a nation's emotional empire disintegrate in real time. The financial and institutional tax applied to this physical tragedy forced a total, immediate rewrite of the tournament's competitive reality. Neymar was evacuated straight to specialized surgical wings, with the national medical directors confirming that his vertebrae had fractured, permanently deleting him from the remainder of the competition. Without their primary creative engine and emotional brand anchor, the Brazilian squad suffered an absolute, clinical performance collapse in their subsequent semi-final against the German dynasty, a historic 7-1 defeat that looked past every predictive model in the sport. The marketing pipelines of the global sponsors looked past their planned campaign real estate, as the primary asset that was supposed to lift the trophy in Rio was instead confined to a wheelchair, watching his country's sporting destiny shatter into a freezing void of public despair. Neymar eventually returned to the grass, successfully reclaiming his professional explosion velocity through grueling surgical and rehabilitation layouts, but the historical record of that afternoon remains the absolute peak of sporting devastation in our archive. A moment where the intersection of human bone and raw, unregulated physical violence permanently altered the emotional ledger of a global superpower. Every legend has a story the highlights never show, a hidden trajectory where clinical data, corporate private equity, and fragile human biology collide to dictate the true cost of the beautiful game. If you want to continue deep diving into the hidden, unsealed files of international sports business, the boardroom betrayals, the medical miracles, and the high-stakes tactical conspiracies that shape your favorite icons, subscribe to the Football Archive and join our investigation into the next untold story waiting inside the vault. See you next time. Bye.